And President Trump's back at it again. This guy's too much. He's out there back on his 51st state. Again, I'm going to ignore him. I'm going to start focusing with our federal government what we can do to be more competitive, to lower taxes, create the environment and conditions for companies to come here and invest in Ontario. That's what we need to do.
You could almost feel this coming. If you look at the arc of the last few days, these sort of random tariff announcements with no detail, they don't seem to make any sense. In part, they affect Canada, but many other countries.
If Canada wants to join the Golden Dome protect missile defense system, they should just join the U.S.
What the Canadian people clearly have stated, virtually without exception, is this will never, ever happen.
It started with one sentence. A smirk, a camera flash, and Donald Trump casually declaring, again, that Canada is basically the 51st state. But this time, it wasn't just political theater. It came right after he slapped Canada with crushing tariffs, 100% on pharmaceuticals, 25% on trucks, and a brutal 50% on lumber. Within days, headlines across Ottawa, Toronto, and Vancouver exploded. Hashtags like Boycott America and Buy Canadian began trending as thousands of Canadians swore off U.S. products, flights, and vacations. Suddenly, malls from Buffalo to Seattle felt emptier. Cross-border car traffic dropped overnight. Trump's taunt didn't just bruise pride. It ignited a nationwide economic rebellion. In the middle of a fragile recovery, one remark just cracked North America's unity wide open. So before we dive deeper, tell me the time and country you're watching from. And if you want to stay ahead of these unfolding trade shocks, make sure to like, subscribe, and keep watching. When Trump dropped his 51st state remark, Canadians didn't just roll their eyes this time, they rolled up their sleeves. Because behind that offhand jab was something far more serious. A full-scale tariff barrage targeting key pillars of the Canadian economy. 100% tax on pharmaceuticals, 25% on trucks, and 50% on lumber. Tariffs that hit not just trade, but national pride. It wasn't diplomacy. It was economic punishment wrapped in sarcasm. For years, Canada had weathered the Trump storms with polite restraint. But in 2025, patience finally cracked. Within 48 hours, social media turned into a battleground. The phrase, "Buy Canadian, not American," went viral, echoed by celebrities, mayors, and even grocery chains. Roughly 70% of Canadians said they planned to reduce U.S. purchases, while others canceled trips and online orders entirely. It wasn't symbolic, it was measurable. Border data showed a 35% drop in cross-border car travel, a staggering figure considering how tightly the two economies are intertwined. Then came the real gut punch for U.S. businesses. Tourism, one of America's quiet cash cows, collapsed almost overnight. Normally, Canadians spend over $35 billion a year traveling south for vacations, shopping, and medical trips. But by early summer, that figure had cratered. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce reported a $12.5 billion loss directly linked to the Canadian boycott. Restaurants in New York, outlet malls in Michigan, and ski resorts in Colorado all saw bookings vanish. Even liquor stores along the border felt the sting. Sales of U.S. spirits in Canada plunged by nearly 60%, while Canadian-made whiskey and vodka suddenly became patriotic purchases. It wasn't just consumer behavior, it was economic defiance. Canada's boycott rippled through supply chains, cutting into demand for trucks, lumber, and pharmaceuticals. Analysts estimate the shift could threaten 31,000 U.S. jobs, especially in regions like the Midwest that rely on cross-border trade. Ironically, the same working-class communities Trump vowed to protect were among the first to feel the backlash. Still, this wasn't just a boycott, it was a statement of identity. Canadians who'd long tolerated American dominance in culture and commerce suddenly rediscovered a sense of economic nationalism. Lawmakers in Ottawa proposed new incentives for domestic manufacturing and even floated restrictions on U.S. imports in sectors like food and construction materials. Newspapers began publishing weekly Made in Canada scorecards. For once, unity didn't come from government policy, it came from public frustration. Trump's comment had lit a fuse under a deeply rooted grievance. Canada's long-standing dependence on U.S. markets. The boycott wasn't just a reaction, it was a reckoning. For decades, Canada's economy had functioned as America's quiet appendage, sending resources south and importing culture back north. But as tariffs bit harder and rhetoric turned mocking, Canadians began asking, why keep playing a game where the rules change at Trump's whim? And so, while Washington dismissed the boycott as temporary outrage, the numbers told another story. American exports to Canada were shrinking, supply routes were shifting, and industries once considered untouchable, like pharmaceuticals and autos, were now searching for alternatives. But the real shift was psychological. For the first time in a generation, Canadians were saying no, not through protests or speeches, but through wallets. And that kind of rebellion, silent and sustained, is far more dangerous to an economy built on trust. Because if economic loyalty can vanish overnight, what does that say about the future of the North American alliance itself? As the boycott gained momentum, another question began to surface in Washington and Ottawa alike. What happens when the money stops moving? That answer was about to emerge in tourism losses, job cuts, and an unraveling trade partnership neither side could easily repair. By mid-year, the boycott had evolved into something far bigger than an online movement. It had become an economic force reshaping Canada's trade map. Retail chains began replacing U.S. suppliers with domestic or European alternatives. Pharmacies that once stocked American pills turned to British and Indian generics. Lumber companies, furious at the 50% tariff wall, stopped bidding on U.S. construction contracts altogether. The effect? A gradual economic decoupling that Washington hadn't anticipated and could no longer control. That's when Prime Minister Mark Carney made his next move, a strategic one. He flew to Mexico City, meeting with Finance Secretary Sheinbaum to discuss diversification away from U.S. dependency. What emerged was a quiet but symbolic deal, joint infrastructure and energy investment aimed at deepening Latin American trade routes. Mexico, still wary of Trump's tariff threats, welcomed Canada's outreach. It was a rare moment of North American realignment, two neighbors turning toward each other while freezing out the United States. For Carney, the message was clear. If Trump wanted to play hardball with tariffs, Canada would find new partners. Ottawa began accelerating talks with the EU and Asia-Pacific nations for expanded trade corridors, including a revived version of the Trans-Pacific Framework. In Brussels, negotiators publicly praised Canada for defending fair trade principles, while privately eyeing the $50 billion in annual commerce up for grabs as Canadian importers abandoned U.S. suppliers. Back home, Canadian industries began to adapt and profit. Lumber exports to Europe spiked. Domestic truck manufacturers, long overshadowed by Detroit, started winning government contracts. Canada's boycott, once viewed as symbolic protest, had quietly evolved into an industrial restructuring. But for the United States, the damage was spreading. Border towns that depended on Canadian shoppers were turning into ghost zones. Outlet malls from Niagara Falls to Duluth reported 40% revenue declines. Hotels along the Great Lakes were slashing staff. Airlines saw ticket sales from Canada fall 22-25%, forcing carriers to cut routes and downsize crews. The most painful irony? These losses weren't the result of foreign sanctions or global crises. They were self-inflicted. Tariffs designed to protect American jobs were now eliminating them. Lumber mills in Wisconsin, auto suppliers in Ohio, and packaging plants in Michigan were quietly announcing layoffs. Analysts predicted up to 31,000 U.S. jobs at risk, concentrated in industries Trump once called the backbone of America. As the situation deteriorated, markets began responding. The Canadian dollar stabilized, while the U.S. dollar softened slightly in border trade metrics. Investors noticed the trend. America's trade leverage, once absolute, was showing cracks. Economists warned that CUSMA, the North American Free Trade Pact, was effectively on life support. What was meant to ensure continental unity was now eroding under a flood of tariffs and nationalist rhetoric. Even international observers began sounding alarms. The seamless North American market, decades in the making, was fracturing piece by piece. And as the dust settled, the symbolism of Trump's 51st state remark grew heavier. It wasn't just a gaffe, it was a mirror. A reflection of how arrogance can turn allies into adversaries and how a single sentence, backed by reckless policy, can unravel a generation of cooperation. Because in the end, tariffs don't just tax goods, they tax trust. And once trust collapses, rebuilding it takes far more than trade deals or speeches. It takes humility, something no tariff can ever buy. So here we are, North America, once the tightest economic alliance on the planet, now splintered over one man's ego and a few careless words. What started as a joke about Canada being the 51st state has snowballed into something far more dangerous. A political Cold War wrapped in trade numbers and boycotts. Billions lost, thousands of jobs gone, and trust shattered across the world's longest border. But the real question isn't what Trump said, it's what comes next. Can the US afford to alienate its closest ally while China and Europe move in to fill the gap? Can Canada rebuild its industries fast enough to survive outside America's shadow? Or has this boycott marked the beginning of a permanent divorce between two nations that once built each other's prosperity? If you've made it this far, I want to hear from you. Do you think Trump's tariffs were justified, or has he just handed America's power to its rivals? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you found this breakdown helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share to help more people understand just how fragile our so-called alliances really are. Because this story isn't over, it's just beginning.